The morning hall in Gangnam is white with chrysanthemums and colder than the marble beneath it. Kang Do-yoon stands before a mirror no one else can see, hands raised to his father's black silk tie, and his fingers will not obey him. Twice he loops it wrong, twice he starts again. Behind him, uncles murmur about seating charts, cousins check their phones, an aide counts the minutes until the doors open. Nobody steps forward. His grandmother watches from her chair and does not move. The tie hangs crooked, undone, exactly like everything else that morning, and still, no one in that family reaches out to help him. A tray of tea passes behind the pillar, carried by a woman in a black catering uniform who is not supposed to approach the family at all. Amara Nuosu sees the crooked tie before she registers whose hands are failing at it. She has tied this exact knot 100 times, on 100 mornings, in a tailor's shop in Enugu that smelled of starch and her father's coffee. Something in her simply moves. She sets the tray down, crosses the roped-off space no staff member is allowed to cross, and reaches for the silk before he can stop her, before either of them understands what has just begun. Her fingers work fast, cross, loop, through, tighten, the motion older than her own memory. Do-yoon goes rigid, then still, watching a stranger's hands do what his own would not. She does not look up at his face, only at the knot, until it sits perfect against his collar. A knot only needs to hold, she says quietly, smoothing the fabric flat. It doesn't need to be perfect. Then, softer, the only kind words spoken to him all morning, and it's all right that your hands shook. Today, of all days, they're allowed to. His eyes find hers for the first time. For one held breath, the hall disappears. The cameras, the calculating relatives, the 300 mourners waiting outside the doors. Then a supervisor's sharp whisper cuts the air, and Amara steps back, picks up her tray, and disappears into the catering line, as if she had never crossed it at all. Do-yoon stands with a perfect knot at his throat and an ache in his chest that has nothing to do with his father. He does not know her name. He does not know where she works, or lives, or comes from. He only knows, with total certainty, that he intends to find her. By 9 in the morning, black cars already lined 3 blocks outside the Kang Group Memorial Hall in Gangnam, and inside, 300 mourners moved through white chrysanthemums arranged with the precision of a boardroom. 6-year-old Kang Ha-eun stood very still in the middle of it, gripping the hem of a dress too formal for a child her age, watching the crowd swallow the woman who was supposed to be holding her hand. She had been told to stay close. She had. It was the world that moved. Adults in dark suits stepped around her without seeing her, murmuring about shares and seating and who would stand where during the bow. Somewhere behind the flower wall, her father was getting ready, and somewhere in the opposite direction, her grandmother's assistant was already occupied with television crews. Ha-eun turned in a slow circle, chin trembling, refusing to cry in a room where crying was reserved for adults with the right last name. She caught the sleeve of the first person who walked slowly enough to notice her, a young woman in a black catering uniform carrying a tray of tea, and she asked, in the smallest voice she owned, if anyone could help her find her dad. Amara Nuosu had been told exactly one rule before her shift began. Never speak to a member of the Kang family. Never make eye contact. Never be seen. She had nodded along with the rest of the catering staff, half listening, more concerned with balancing 40 cups of tea across a hall built for people who noticed nothing beneath their own grief. But a crying child broke every rule written for grown-ups. She set her tray on the nearest table without asking permission, and crouched until she was level with the small, frightened face in front of her. Hey, look at me," she said, in the voice she used to use for her younger cousins back in Enugu, steady and unhurried. "We're going to find him together, okay? What does he look like?" Ha-eun described a tall man in a black suit with hair like her own, and Amara filed the description away, more useful than any instruction her supervisor had given her that morning. She took the girl's small hand, felt it tighten around her fingers with the particular trust that children give only to adults who kneel down first, and began walking the perimeter of the hall, scanning faces no one had told her she was allowed to study. They passed an aide speaking urgently into a phone about the seating chart for the front row, and Amara asked if he knew where the girl's father might be. He glanced down at Ha-eun for exactly 1 second and said he was busy, that someone from the family office would sort it out, and kept walking. They passed 2 men in identical dark suits debating, in low-clipped Korean, who among the family should be photographed standing closest to the casket. Neither looked at the child holding a stranger's hand. Amara did not recognize the language, but she recognized the tone, the sound of people too occupied with what a death might rearrange to notice what it had actually broken. She kept walking, kept scanning, until Ha-un suddenly stopped pulling and instead pointed past a pillar of white flowers, toward a man standing half-hidden from the receiving line, his hands raised to his own throat, fighting a black silk tie that would not sit straight no matter how many times he restarted it. "That's my dad," Ha-un whispered, and something in her small voice cracked open, because even from a distance, she could tell her father's hands were shaking, and no one beside him was doing anything about it. Amara delivered Ha-un the last several steps herself, close enough now to see the man's hands clearly, knuckles pale, fingers working the same failed loop over and over, a muscle ticking hard along his jaw. Ha-un let go of her hand and ran the rest of the way, wrapping both arms around her father's leg, and for one unguarded second his whole face changed, grief and relief crossing it at once before he caught himself and smoothed it back into the composure a room full of cameras required. He thanked Amara with a small, distracted nod, already looking past her toward the doors that would open in minutes. She should have walked away then. Every rule she had been given told her to walk away then. Instead, she stood half a step outside the roped line, watching his hands fail at the same knot for a fourth time, while 3 relatives passed within arm's reach of him, and not one of them stopped, not one of them offered, all of them far too busy deciding who would inherit what, to notice that the man expected to inherit the most was falling apart in plain sight. His aunt, Kang Seo-yeon, sat in the front row in unrelieved black, and she alone seemed to actually see him struggling, because her eyes tracked her nephew's hands with the sharp attention of a woman who had spent 40 years reading rooms for a living. She did not rise, she did not send anyone to help, she simply watched, filing the moment away the way she filed every weakness she witnessed in that family, information to be used later, not comfort to be given now. Beside her, Kang Tae-sik, the chairman's younger brother, leaned toward another board member, and murmured something that made them both glance toward Do-yoon with expressions closer to calculation than concern. "Look at him," Tae-sik said quietly, in the tone of a man building a case rather than mourning a brother. "Hands like that, running an empire." No one corrected him. No one moved to fix the tie either. The family that would spend the next 6 months fighting over succession sat within 10 feet of the heir apparent falling apart, and every one of them treated it as evidence rather than an emergency, which was, Amara would understand much later, the entire and terrible logic of that family. Her supervisor's warning replayed in Amara's head with irritating clarity: invisible, silent, professional, do not so much as make eye contact with the family. She needed this job. Rent on the 1-room apartment she shared with 2 other Nigerian women was due in 11 days, and design school tuition was due after that, money she had been saving in careful stacks since she arrived in Seoul 2 years earlier with a suitcase, a sewing kit that had belonged to her father, and a stubborn refusal to go home without something to show for the leaving. Crossing that rope a second time could cost her the shift, maybe the contract, maybe the reference her supervisor had half promised for a hotel further up the ladder. And yet her eyes kept returning to the tie, to hands that could not manage a knot her own father had taught her before she could properly read, back in a tailor's shop in Enugu that smelled of steam and starch, and the particular patience of a man who believed anyone could learn anything if someone simply showed them how, slowly, without shame. An aide's voice cut through the hall, clipped and formal, announcing that the doors to the receiving line would open in 2 minutes, and the ripple of adjustment that followed, spines straightening, expressions arranging themselves into appropriate grief, made it clear that whatever was happening to Do-yoon needed to resolve itself immediately or be broadcast to 300 mourners and however many cameras waited beyond those doors. He tried the knot a 5th time. It came apart in his hands, silk sliding loose exactly as it had the first time, and for one raw second something other than composure crossed his face, something closer to a boy who had lost his father and did not know how to stand up straight in front of a room that would judge him for it either way. Amara watched that second happen. She had spent 2 years in Seoul learning which parts of herself to make invisible for a paycheck, and she was about to make herself very visible instead. She set down the second tray she had been holding since Ha-un's rescue, checked once, briefly, for her supervisor's location, and stepped across the rope. He felt her hands before he understood what was happening, cool fingers closing over his own where they gripped the ruined knot, gentle but absolutely certain, the touch of someone who had done this 1,000 times and had no intention of being stopped. His first instinct was to step back. A stranger did not touch a Kang at a state funeral, not without consequence, not without someone somewhere writing a report about it. But something in the economy of her movement, the total absence of hesitation, made him go still instead. He looked down and found a woman he had never seen in his life, dark eyes fixed entirely on the silk between them, already working the tangled loop loose with quick, sure fingers. She had not asked permission. She had not looked up to check if permission was needed. She was simply fixing what was broken, the way a person fixes a broken thing when everyone else in the room has decided it is someone else's job. And for the length of 3 breaths, Do-yoon forgot that 300 people were waiting for him to walk through a set of doors and become, publicly, his father's replacement. Up close, the tie was heavier than it looked. Old raw silk with a faint woven crest at the tip, and Amara recognized quality when she felt it under her fingers. This was not a tie a person bought for a funeral. This was a tie someone had worn for years and kept for a reason. She crossed the wide end over the narrow, looped it through, pulled it snug without cutting off his breath, adjusting the dimple at the center, the exact way her father used to, 2 fingers pinching just below the knot, while the other hand drew it tight. Do-yoon's breathing had gone shallow and careful, as if he were afraid that moving might undo whatever she was building. This was his, he said quietly, unprompted, surprising himself with the admission. My father's. I'm supposed to wear it today. Amara's hands did not slow. Then it should hold, she said simply, and finished the knot with a small definitive tug, smoothing the fabric down against his chest with the flat of her palm, the way a tailor checks their own work before letting a customer see it in the mirror. She finally looked up at his face, and whatever she saw there, the specific exhaustion of a man who had not slept, who had signed condolence cards until his hand cramped, who had not been allowed 1 private minute to simply be sad, made her add something she had not planned to say. A knot only needs to hold, she told him, voice pitched low enough that it belonged only to the 2 of them. It doesn't need to be perfect. Then, quieter still, the sentence that would return to him for months afterward, at odd, unguarded hours. And it's all right that your hands shook. Today, of all days, they're allowed to. Nobody else in that hall had told him that, not his aunt, watching from her chair, not his uncle, already turning grief into leverage, not the dozen advisors who had spent the morning coaching him on posture and eye contact for the cameras. A stranger in a catering uniform had said the only true thing spoken to him since he had woken up that morning, and Do-yoon stood there with a perfect knot at his throat, unable to look away from her. A supervisor's voice hissed her name from across the hall at the exact moment the great doors began to open, and Amara stepped back into her role the way a diver surfaces, fast and automatic, tray back in her hands, eyes back on the floor, invisible again, before anyone official could clock what had just happened. Do-yoon turned to walk the receiving line with a steady collar and no memory, later, of how he crossed the threshold. What neither of them noticed was Kang So-yeon, who had watched the entire exchange from her seat with the stillness of a woman who missed nothing that mattered to her family's future. The crying child returned safely to her father's leg, and now this, a hotel worker crossing 2 ropes in one morning to fix what an entire family of executives had been too paralyzed or too calculating to touch. So-yeon did not smile, she rarely did, but she leaned toward the assistant seated beside her and murmured 4 quiet words that would, though no one could have known it yet, alter the shape of everything that followed. Find out who she is. By the time the receiving line ended, hours later, Do-yoon had shaken 400 hands, bowed to people who wanted his company and people who wanted his job, and repeated the same rehearsed sentence about his father so many times it had stopped sounding like language. Only one moment from the entire day had stayed sharp in his memory, cool hands over his own, a low voice telling him his shaking was allowed. He did not know her name. He had not thought to ask it, too startled by the fact of her, and by the time he thought to look for her again, the catering staff had already begun clearing the hall, indistinguishable in their black uniforms, gone as completely as if she had never crossed the rope at all. That evening, back in an apartment that felt too large and too quiet, he pulled his assistant aside and asked him to find out which catering company had staffed the memorial and which of their servers had short braided hair and a slight accent he could not place. He did not tell his aunt he was looking. He did not yet know she was looking too. 3 days later, Amara was hemming a mannequin skirt in the cramped back room of her design night class when her phone buzzed with a message from her catering supervisor, toned somewhere between confused and alarmed. A representative from Kang Group had called the agency directly, asking specifically for the server who had assisted the family during the memorial. Amara's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with excitement. Company complaints traveled that fast too. She spent the walk back to her apartment cataloging every possible violation, crossing the rope, touching a client without consent, speaking when she had been told to stay silent, building a case against herself before anyone else could. It was only when she arrived and found a car idling outside her building, a driver holding a door open with the patient stillness of someone used to waiting, that she understood this was not a complaint, it was a summons. She smoothed down her only good blouse, the one she saved for gallery openings she rarely got invited to, and got in, half convinced she was about to be fired in person, out of some strange, formal Korean corporate courtesy. The car did not take her to an office. It took her to a private tea room in a hanok on the edge of the city, warm wood and low light, worlds away from both the funeral hall and the fluorescent hum of her design classroom. Do-yoon stood when she entered, still in the same careful, contained posture, though the suit was gray now instead of black, and the tie, she noticed, was a different one. "I didn't get your name," he said, before anything else, as if that omission had bothered him more than she would have guessed. She told him. He told her his full name, full title, acting chairman of Kang Group following his father's death, information that rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last 3 days. The tea room, the driver, the quiet way the staff outside had bowed to him and not to her, all of it suddenly made sense, and made her acutely, uncomfortably aware of the gap between the man across the low table and the tailor's daughter who had spent that morning altering a $19 hem for a stranger's dress rehearsal. He offered, carefully, the way a man offers something he suspects will be refused. A position, he said, within one of the group's hospitality properties, better pay, better hours, a formal role instead of catering shift work that could vanish at the whim of an agency. It was meant as gratitude, she understood that. She also understood, instantly, exactly what accepting it would make her, the woman who fixed the chairman's tie and got promoted for it, a story that would follow her through every kitchen and boardroom in Seoul for the rest of her career. "I appreciate it," she said, and meant it, before setting the offer down as gently as she could. "But I didn't help you so you'd owe me something. I helped because your hands were shaking, and nobody else in that room was going to do anything about it." She told him, plainly, that she was 2 semesters from finishing a design certificate she had been paying for 1 shift at a time, that she intended to finish it the same way she started it, and that she would rather keep her job at the catering agency than owe her next promotion to a funeral. Do-yoon did not argue, which surprised her more than the offer itself had. Most people, in her experience, pushed twice after a first refusal, testing whether the no was real or simply politeness waiting to be talked out of itself. He simply nodded, turned his teacup a quarter turn on its saucer, and said that his father used to tell him that anyone who refused an easy reward for doing the right thing was usually the only person in the room worth trusting, though his father, he added dryly, had rarely practiced what he preached. It was the first thing close to a joke he had made in her presence, and it startled a short laugh out of her before she could stop it. He walked her back out to the car himself, an act she would later learn was unusual enough that his driver mentioned it, quietly, to 2 other staff members before the week was out. He did not ask to see her again. He did not need to. Kang Group, he already knew, had 6 major events scheduled over the following 2 months, and every one of them would need catering. The first gala came 2 weeks later, a shareholder dinner in a ballroom with a ceiling of gold leaf, and Amara recognized the venue's private elevator before she recognized the man standing near the bar pretending not to watch the kitchen doors. Her supervisor had been thrilled to land the Kang Group contract, oblivious to the fact that the client had specifically requested the same catering company as the memorial, down to the same team lead. Amara said nothing about that. She carried trays of champagne through a room worth more than her entire building, aware, in the particular way a person becomes aware of weather changing, of exactly where Do-yoon stood at any given moment, without ever once looking directly at him. Near the end of the evening, as guests thinned toward the doors, he intercepted her path with the practiced casualness of a man who had planned the intersection for an hour. "The tie held," he said, by way of greeting, nodding faintly toward his own collar, and something about the small absurdity of the statement, delivered with total seriousness in a room full of investment bankers, made her smile before she remembered she was supposed to be invisible. 3 days after the gala, Amara's phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and, on the other end, Ha-eun's voice, breathless and pre-negotiated by an adult standing somewhere nearby, asking if the Thai lady also knew how to fix a button, because her school recital costume had lost one that morning, and her father did not know how to sew, and the housekeeper was busy, and the recital was in 4 hours. Amara laughed before she could catch herself, charmed despite every instinct, telling her this family was becoming a complication she did not have room for. She went anyway, on her one afternoon off that week, and found Ha-eun sitting on the kitchen counter of an apartment larger than her entire building back home, swinging her legs while Amara threaded a needle and reattached a small pearl button to pale pink fabric. Do-yoon hovered in the doorway the entire time, unnecessarily, watching his daughter chatter easily with a woman she had met exactly twice, and something in his chest loosened at the sight of it, the particular relief of watching a child be simply happy in a house that had not had much room for that lately. After that, small things began arriving with a regularity neither of them named directly. An umbrella appeared, unasked. The evening a sudden downpour caught the catering staff loading vans in the rain, sent down by a driver who claimed only to be following instructions. A coffee, exactly the way she liked it, though she had never told anyone how she liked it, showed up at the service entrance during a corporate lunch, delivered by an assistant who wouldn't say who sent it, though the answer was obvious enough that Amara stopped pretending to be surprised. She told herself each time that it meant nothing, that wealthy men were simply generous with logistics the way other people were generous with money, and each time she found herself glancing toward the private elevator anyway, cataloging whether he was there before she caught herself doing it. Her roommates noticed first, teasing her over cheap wine about the mysterious chairman who kept finding reasons to be near the loading dock of every event she worked, and Amara denied it with more heat than the accusation warranted, which, as her roommates pointed out, was usually how these things started. When the catering team was asked to prepare a small private dinner for Do-yoon and Ha-eun rather than a formal gala, Amara volunteered to cook one dish herself, off the clock, off the contract, jollof rice, the recipe her mother still made every Sunday back in Enugu, rich with tomato and smoked paprika, and a particular patience that could not be rushed. Ha-eun ate 2 full plates and declared, with the total conviction of a 6-year-old, that it was better than anything in Seoul, including ice cream, which Amara chose to take as the highest possible compliment. Do-yoon ate slower, watching his daughter laugh with her mouth full in a way she rarely did at the long formal table they usually shared, and asked quiet, genuine questions about the dish, about Enugu, about a father who had taught his daughter to cook the way hers had taught her to sew. In exchange, he told her, haltingly, about his own mother's cooking, gone now for 6 years, and about how strange it was that grief could live comfortably inside a good meal in a way it never quite could inside a boardroom. The night it truly started to feel dangerous, in the specific way good things feel dangerous right before you let yourself want them, was the night a late event ran 3 hours over, and Amara missed the last bus by 11 minutes, standing under a bus shelter in rain that had turned the street into a sheet of moving light. Do-yoon's car pulled up before she had finished calculating how far a walk home would be. She refused at first, out of the same pride that had refused his job offer weeks earlier, insisting she would find another way, and he simply held the door open and said nothing, waiting with a patience that made refusing feel more like performance than principle. She got in. They did not talk about the gap between them, the ballroom money and the borrowed umbrella. Not directly, but somewhere on the quiet drive across a bridge strung with light, Amara found herself telling him about her father's shop, and he found himself telling her about the first time he had ever tied a tie alone, badly, for his own mother's funeral. Nobody helping him then either, and the silence after that confession felt like the most honest thing either of them had said all week. He told her, one evening at the tea house that had become their unofficial meeting place, about the board meeting scheduled for the following month, the one where his fitness to lead would be formally reviewed by men who had known him since he was a child and would still vote against him if it served their interests. He admitted, in the careful, rationed way he admitted anything difficult, that he was not entirely certain he wanted the company at all, only that refusing it felt like a second failure stacked on top of losing his father. Amara did not offer comfort the way people usually offered it to men like him, all soft reassurance and inflated confidence. She asked him a direct question instead. what he would actually want to build, if the seat were simply his and no one could take it away, and watched him sit with it longer than anyone in his family had ever given him room to. "I don't know," he admitted finally, and it sounded less like defeat than like the first honest thing he had said about the company since his father died. And she told him that not knowing yet was not the same thing as failing. On a Saturday afternoon that had somehow, without official planning, become a standing arrangement, Amara sat at the kitchen island, teaching Ha-Yun to thread a needle properly, guiding small fingers through the motion her own father had guided hers through 20 years earlier in a shop that no longer existed. Ha-Yun's stitches were crooked and enthusiastic, sewing a button onto a scrap of felt for no reason except that she had asked to learn, and Amara found herself narrating the lesson exactly the way her father used to, patient, unhurried, correcting without criticizing. Do-Yun stood in the doorway again, as he often did now, no longer pretending the reason he lingered was supervision. He watched Amara's hands guide his daughters, watched the ease between them that had taken his own family generations of formal dinners and inherited silence to fail at building, and understood, with the quiet, undramatic clarity of a fact settling into place, that he was no longer simply grateful to this woman. He was something closer to attached, dangerously so, in the specific way that made a careful man start rearranging his calendar around a stranger's shift schedule without admitting to himself why. He asked her opinion on something real for the first time a week later, not the tie, not the food, but a decision the board wanted him to make about closing an unprofitable division that employed nearly 200 people, mostly older workers his father had refused to lay off, even when the numbers argued for it. He did not need her business advice, he told her honestly, and she believed him. He needed someone who would tell him the truth without calculating what the truth would cost them. She thought about it for a long moment, then told him plainly that numbers were easy to defend and much harder to live with, that her own father had kept 2 apprentices on the payroll during a bad year rather than let them go hungry, and that some decisions cost you money and were still the only decisions worth making. It was not sophisticated advice. It was not the kind of counsel his consultants gave him, but he found himself returning to it 3 days later in the boardroom, and for the first time since his father's death, he made a decision that felt entirely his own, rather than inherited. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, no gala, no crisis, only the two of them in the tea house after Ha-Yun had fallen asleep against a cushion nearby, the low light making the room feel smaller than it was. Do-Yun reached across the table to move a stray strand of hair from Amara's face, an unplanned gesture that surprised them both, his hand pausing halfway there, as if only then registering what he was about to do. She did not pull back. Neither did she lean in. They simply sat inside that suspended half-second, close enough to feel the shape of what neither of them had said out loud, while somewhere in the city his aunt was reviewing security reports that mentioned his car's movements more often than she liked, and a photographer 3 blocks from the last gala had already begun asking questions about the woman who kept appearing in the acting chairman's peripheral vision. His hand found the edge of the table instead of her cheek, and he withdrew it, not because he wanted to, but because some careful, trained part of him understood, even then, that whatever this was becoming would not stay private for very much longer. The summons came the way Amara imagined most things came from that family: a car at the curb, a driver who wouldn't explain, a destination that turned out to be a private dining room rather than an office. Kang So-yeon sat waiting with the stillness of a woman who had already decided how the conversation would go before Amara arrived, and she did not waste time on pleasantries. "You fixed my nephew's tie," she said, once tea had been poured and the door had closed. "That was kind. This is not a kindness anymore." She laid out, without cruelty but without softness either, exactly what Amara's continued presence in Do-Yun's life would cost. A board vote 3 weeks away, a press corps that fed on any hint of instability in the family, a company his father had spent 40 years building, now resting on a young man's ability to appear, above all things, controlled. "I am not asking you to disappear because I think badly of you," So-yeon said, and something in her tone suggested this was, for her, an unusual admission. "I am asking because I know exactly how badly this family treats anyone who becomes a liability to it." An envelope appeared on the table between them at some point, thick enough that Amara did not need to open it to understand its purpose, and she looked at it for a long moment before sliding it back across the polished wood without touching the contents. "I didn't come here for money the first time," she said, keeping her voice level though her pulse was not, and I'm not going to start needing it now just because you're offering some. She told So-yeon plainly about the design certificate she was 2 semesters from finishing, about the small atelier she hoped to open one day with her own name on the door, about a life she had been building shift by shift long before she ever touched that tie, and she made it clear, without raising her voice, that none of those plans required Do-yeon's company, his money, or his family's approval to succeed. "I'm not trying to become a Kang," she said finally. "I'm trying to become a designer. Your nephew is a separate question, and honestly, that one isn't mine to answer for you." So-yeon studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her expression. "You remind me of someone," So-yeon said eventually, and did not elaborate on who, though the faint softening at the corner of her mouth suggested the comparison was not an insult. She warned Amara anyway, precisely and without apology, that Tae-sik had already hired a research firm to look into anything that might be used against Do-yoon before the board vote, that a hotel worker attached to the acting chairman would be a gift Tae-sik would not hesitate to unwrap in front of cameras, and that the version of this story the press eventually told would not be the version either of them had lived. "They will not call you kind," So-yeon said. "They will call you opportunistic, or worse, and they will not care whether it's true, only whether it's useful." Amara left the tea room with the envelope still unopened on the table behind her, and So-yeon's warning sitting heavier in her chest than the offer had, because for the first time since the funeral, she understood that this was no longer a private matter between 2 people who liked each other. It had become a liability with a timeline. She told Do-yeon about the meeting 2 nights later, choosing her words carefully, and watched his jaw tighten in a way she recognized from the funeral hall, the specific stillness of a man absorbing bad news in front of an audience, even when the audience was only her. He apologized, immediately and completely, for a conversation he had not been part of and could not undo, and offered to speak to his aunt directly, an offer Amara refused just as quickly, unwilling to be managed even by someone who meant well. "I'm not asking you to fix this," she told him. "I'm telling you it happened, because I don't want to be someone who hides things from you the way your whole family hides things from each other." He went quiet at that, turning the observation over, and admitted, finally, that the board vote was closer than he had told her, 3 weeks rather than the vague timeline he had implied, and that Tae-sik had spent the past month building a narrative about instability that a photograph of the 2 of them together would complete far too easily. Neither of them said what they were both already bracing for. It happened on a Sunday that had felt, up until that point, like the safest kind of ordinary, the 3 of them at a weekend market near the river, Ha-eun running ahead between stalls of grilled skewers and fabric bolts, Amara laughing at something Do-yoon had said with the unguarded ease of a woman who had briefly forgotten to be careful. None of them noticed the man with the long lens standing across the street, a freelance photographer who had been quietly tailing Kang Group's acting chairman for 3 weeks on a tip from someone close to Tae-sik's office, patient enough to wait for exactly this, an unposed, unmistakably intimate moment, a child holding both their hands at once, laughter instead of the careful public composure Do-yoon wore everywhere else. The photograph would run within 36 hours under a headline neither of them could have predicted the cruelty of, and in the last ordinary minutes before that happened, Amara bought a bag of roasted chestnuts, split it 3 ways, and thought, briefly and dangerously, that this was what her life might actually look like if she let herself believe in it. The headline called her the hotel maid, a title stripped of her name, her country, her 2 years of night classes, reduced entirely to a uniform and a wage. The article speculated about motive in language that circled, without ever quite saying it outright, the oldest and ugliest assumption available, that a black African woman photographed beside a Korean billionaire could only be after one thing, that warmth like hers had to be a strategy rather than simply who she was. Comment sections filled overnight with cruelty dressed as concern for the company's reputation, strangers debating her worth in a language she was still learning to read fluently, and Amara sat in her small shared apartment reading every word of it once, deliberately, before closing the laptop and refusing to open it again. It was not the accusation of gold digging that hollowed her out, not really. It was the total erasure of everything else she was, the tailor's daughter, the design student, the woman who had crouched down for a lost child before she had ever touched a tie, collapsed into 2 dismissive words, because that story was easier to sell than the true one. Her supervisor called her into the agency's cramped back office the following morning, apologetic in the specific way people are apologetic, right before delivering news they have already decided not to fight. Kang Group represented nearly a third of the agency's annual contracts, he explained, and their office had already received a call, polite, careful, but unmistakable, suggesting it would be best for everyone if Amara were reassigned away from any future Kang events, effective immediately. He did not use the word fired. He used the word restructured, and Amara understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has been let go gently before, that the distinction existed entirely for his comfort rather than hers. She thought about arguing, about pointing out that she had never once behaved unprofessionally on a single shift, that the photograph had been taken on her own time, at a public market, doing nothing wrong. She said none of it. She had learned, over 2 years of temporary contracts in a country that could revoke her visa sponsorship faster than it could explain why, that dignity sometimes meant leaving a room before you were asked to, and she left that one without raising her voice. Tae-sik brought a printed copy of the article to the emergency session he had called 3 days early, sliding it across the table with the theatrical calm of a man who had been waiting months for exactly this kind of ammunition. He did not attack Do-yoon's competence directly. That would have been too obvious, too easily defended. Instead, he asked, in a tone of manufactured concern, whether a chairman whose judgment could be so thoroughly compromised by a hotel employee within months of taking the seat was a chairman the board could trust with decisions worth billions of won. Several board members who had said nothing during the first round of succession discussions suddenly found their voices, murmuring about optics and stability and the family's public image, and Do-yoon understood, watching it unfold, that the tie itself had never really been the story his family cared about. His grief was acceptable. His hands shaking at a funeral had been, in its way, forgivable weakness. But a black immigrant woman photographed laughing beside him, unguarded and visibly happy, threatened something in the room that no amount of quarterly earnings could fully explain, and he sat through the meeting with his jaw locked, saying almost nothing, absorbing every word. Amara did not call him. She told herself, in the days that followed, that this was practical rather than wounded, that reaching out would only hand Tae-sik more material, that the kindest thing she could do for a man fighting for his company was disappear quietly from the photographs that kept circulating. The truth, underneath that reasoning, was simpler and harder to admit. She was tired of being a liability in other people's calculations, tired of a story that had started with her own choice to cross a rope now being told entirely without her voice in it. She spent her newly empty shifts finishing coursework instead, hemming a final collection piece for her design certificate late into the night, and told her roommates when they asked that it was over before it had really become anything, a sentence she repeated so often it almost started to feel true. Across the city, Do-yoon called the number he had for her 4 times in 3 days, and reached only silence, and stood in his apartment on the 4th night holding a phone that would not ring back, beginning, for the first time since the funeral, to understand exactly how much he stood to lose by doing nothing. It was Ha-eun in the end who said the thing his advisors, his aunt, and his own careful instincts had all avoided saying directly. She asked him, over a dinner he had barely touched, why the Thai lady didn't come anymore, and when he tried to explain it in terms a 6-year-old could accept, she cut through his careful phrasing with the blunt clarity, "Only children are allowed." "Did you let her leave?" she asked, not quite a question. "Or did you make her?" He did not have a good answer. He sat with that failure long after Ha-eun had gone to bed, turning over 3 weeks of silence, of strategic distance, of telling himself that protecting the company meant protecting the distance between them, and understood, with the specific shame of a man recognizing his own family's patterns repeating inside him, that he had done exactly what his relatives always did, treated a person as a liability to be managed, rather than someone worth standing beside in public. He picked up his phone, not to call her, but to call his communications director, and asked her to schedule an unscheduled statement before the week's board vote. He stood in front of the board 3 days later without prepared remarks written by anyone but himself, and instead of addressing the closing of the unprofitable division or the quarterly projections everyone expected, he addressed the article directly, by name, in front of every camera his aunt's team had quietly arranged to be present. He said that the woman in the photograph had a name, Amara Nwosu, and a story that had nothing to do with his company's money, that she had crossed a rope she was forbidden to cross to fix a dying man's tie while his own family sat and watched, that she had comforted his daughter before anyone in his bloodline thought to, and that if the board considered his judgment compromised by gratitude towards someone who had shown him more decency in one morning than most of the room had shown him in a year, then perhaps the board's judgment was the one worth questioning. Tae-sik's face went carefully blank. Several board members exchanged glances they thought were subtle. Seo-yun, watching from the side of the room, allowed herself, for the first time in the entire ordeal, something close to a smile. 2 states away from any of that, in a cramped design classroom that smelled of fabric dye and coffee, Amara opened an email she had refreshed for 11 days straight and found, finally, the answer to an application she had almost talked herself out of submitting: acceptance into a competitive residency at a design house in Milan, 6 months, a stipend, mentorship from names she had grown up reading in magazines her mother kept under the sewing table. It was everything she had told So-yun she wanted. Proof, undeniable and self-made, that none of it had ever required Do-yoon's world to succeed. It should have felt uncomplicated. Instead, she sat with the acceptance letter open on her laptop for a long time, aware of a strange, unwelcome grief threading through the joy, because leaving now, whatever happened with the board vote, whatever he had or had not said publicly, would mean leaving before she knew the ending, to a story she had not meant to become part of. She did not decide anything that night, but for the first time since the photograph, she let herself think about him without immediately shutting the thought down out of self-protection. She heard about the board statement the way most of Seoul did, secondhand and fast, a clip of it playing on a television mounted above the counter of the corner store where she bought her evening rice, his voice steady and unmistakable, her own name spoken clearly into a room full of cameras that would carry it to millions of people who had spent a week calling her a hotel maid and worse. She stood frozen in the aisle long enough that the shopkeeper asked if she was all right. She was not entirely sure. Somewhere between fear and vindication sat something that felt almost like anger, that he had made this choice publicly, permanently, without asking her first whether she wanted her name attached to a corporate power struggle at all. And beneath that anger, undeniable and larger than it, was the fact that a man had finally chosen, in front of everyone who mattered to his family's future, not to make her disappear. She put the rice back on the shelf, unpurchased, and walked out into the evening, still holding her acceptance letter to Milan, no longer sure which decision she was actually walking toward. She found him at the tea house, the only place that had ever felt like neutral ground between his world and hers, and he stood the moment he saw her the way he had the very first time, careful, uncertain whether he was allowed to hope. She told him about Milan before she told him anything else, watched his face carefully for the flicker of a man about to ask her to stay, to choose him over the residency, and braced herself to refuse it the way she had refused the job offer months earlier. He did not ask her to stay. He told her, instead, that he had spent 3 weeks learning exactly what it cost people in his family when someone else's ambition became inconvenient, and that he would rather love her from a distance for 6 months than ask her to shrink her life to fit conveniently inside his. It was, she realized, the single most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, precisely because it asked her for nothing. She told him she was still deciding. He told her that was allowed too, echoing, without fully realizing it, words she had once said to him about hands that shook. She left for Milan 6 weeks later, the residency exactly as demanding and unglamorous as she had hoped. 16-hour days of pattern work and fabric sourcing, and a mentor who corrected her stitches with the same unsentimental patience her father once had. Do-yoon did not fly out to surprise her, did not send elaborate gestures designed for an audience. He called it hours that worked around a 6-hour time difference, sent photographs of Ha-yoon's crooked new stitches, and once, without any announcement, mailed her a spool of navy silk thread that matched, she realized when she held it up to the light, the exact color of his father's tie. Neither of them called it a relationship out loud, not yet, careful with a word that would mean something different across an ocean than it had across a kitchen island. But when Kang Group scheduled the 1-year memorial and Do-yoon's formal confirmation as chairman for the same week in early autumn, he asked her, plainly, if she would come, not as staff, not as a rumor to be managed, but as herself. And this time, she did not need to think about her answer for very long. The morning of the confirmation, in a room full of the same relatives who had once watched his hands shake without moving to help, Do-yoon's tie came loose at the collar again, not from nerves this time, but because he had asked her, deliberately, to be the one who fixed it, in front of everyone who needed to see it happen. Amara crossed no rope this time, She had been invited across it months ago and never quite left. She straightened the silk with the same sure motions from the funeral hall. Cross, loop, through, tighten, while So-yeon watched from her chair with an expression that had finally settled into something like approval, and Tae-sik, seated 3 rows back, said nothing at all. A knot only needs to hold, Amara said again, softly, for an audience of exactly 1 this time, though half the room could see her lips move. When it was finished, old habit nearly carried her a step backward, toward the edges of the room where she had spent 2 years making herself invisible for other people's comfort. Do-yeon caught her hand before she could take it. "Stay," he said, quietly enough for privacy, firmly enough that everyone watching understood exactly what he meant. "Not at the edge of the room. Stay here." By the following spring, the small atelier Amara had once described to Kang Seo-yeon as a plan rather than a possibility had become a real address near the fabric district, her name stitched in small, unshowy letters above the door, exactly the way she had always imagined it, funded by her own savings and the Milan stipend and nothing else. Do-yeon came by most evenings after work, not as chairman, not as a client, just as a man who liked to sit in the back of a shop that smelled like starch and thread while his daughter practiced stitches on scraps of donated fabric at the counter. On the anniversary of the funeral, without either of them planning it, Amara found the navy silk tie folded carefully in a drawer at his apartment, the one that had started everything, and mended a small fray along its seam simply because it needed mending, not because anyone had asked her to. She did not think of it as a symbol while she did it. It was only later, watching him wear it again to an ordinary dinner, steady-handed, unhurried, that she understood the knot had held exactly as long as she'd promised it would, and so, in the end, had they.